Good morning. I'm Professor Harriet Dunbar-Morris, the Provost and Pro-Vice-Chancellor Academic at the University of Buckingham. I'm delighted to host this morning's session for you. I came last year with my husband to this conference and it was a delightful day. So when Joe asked me to chair, I was really happy to. I'm going to introduce each of the speakers and ask them to come up and speak for 30 minutes and then questions for 15 minutes. So the first speaker this morning is Professor Angie Hobbs from the University of Sheffield, and she's going to talk to us about Can We Move? Zeno the Dialectician. So over to you, Angie.
Thank you. So thank you so much. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for inviting me. It's very generous of you to invite somebody who is not a physicist or a mathematician. I'm a philosopher. I have a job in the public understanding of philosophy, and with my academic hat on, I specialize in ancient Greek philosophy and in ethical and political theory. I used to think, until yesterday, I thought that the scariest thing I had ever done professionally was speaking in the Scottish Parliament on healthy and unhealthy ways of caring about a nation. But actually, this takes the biscuit. So I'm definitely out of my comfort zone, but I think it's important to go out of your comfort zone. I do know a bit about ancient Greek philosophy. So what I'm going to be doing is putting Zeno in his intellectual context, and I'm going to be raising some of the philosophical issues that I think he's raising and that his contemporaries certainly thought he was raising. I should make it crystal clear that any mathematical or physical theory I refer to in this talk is a theory of the 5th and 4th centuries BCE, which is all I know about. I'm going to leave it to you in the questions to tell me whether you think Zeno's paradoxes against motion are still of interest to mathematicians and physicists. So I'm definitely not going there, though I'm really interested to hear. My daughter probably could go there because she's doing a PhD in theoretical physics. And when she heard I was giving this talk, with great filial supportiveness, she nearly fell off her chair laughing. So anyway, here we go. So we've got Zeno, who is born, we think about 490 BCE. We don't know when he died. We know it has to be after 450 BCE for reasons that will become clear. He comes from Elia anyway, you will see Elia, it's just below Paestum, on what is in now the border between Campania and Calabria. In southern Italy, in a Greek colony in what was then known as Magna Graecia. When he was only 24, he wrote a book of 40 paradoxes. The book does not survive. We only have a few references in later writers, such as Aristotle and Simplicius. And again, we don't know usually whether Aristotle and Simplicius are quoting or paraphrasing or just summarizing. And Zeno says that he's writing in support of his friend, his not exactly tutor, but his master Parmenides. And we're going to have to spend about a few seconds on Parmenides. His way of truth is actually really complex and difficult and fascinating argument, but we don't have time for that now. We're just going to look at the conclusion of the way of truth, which is that there is only one thing, being. And being is unchanging, unmoving, undifferentiated. I've said eternal here. Well, the Greek word is arē, which can refer to eternity and it can refer to a continuous present. Anyway, being did not come into being, it does not going to go out of being, and time and space and motion, as we perceive them in the phenomenal world, are illusions. Now, there is a Greek word for time, chronos. There isn't exactly a word for space. I'm using space basically is a kind of catch-all term for anything which answers the question where. So time refers to anything the Greeks thought was answering the question when, and space refers to anything that they think is answering the question where, including place. So when you hear the word place later in this talk, that's sort of in this philosophical concept of space. And you'll also hear me talking about the theory there is only one thing, the theory of being. I'm going to use that as shorthand. It's an umbrella term for the whole of this, for the notion that there is no change, no movement, no differentiation, no different objects, no motion, no time, no space. So the theory there is just one thing embraces all of that. Okay, now, just before we really, we're going to look at their amazing visit to Athens in 450 BCE. And I've already made it clear that I'm only talking about the physical and mathematical theories of the time. I think we should just say a word about the Greek word paradox, para meaning against, doxa, an opinion, a commonly received opinion or belief. And he writes the book, as far as we know, about all sorts of paradoxes, not just against motion, but against the existence of place, against all sorts of forms of plurality. Only 8 survive in any kind of form at all. Okay, now, these 4 paradoxes concerning motion, which we get from book 6 of Aristotle's Physics. 2 treat space and time as infinitely divisible, the dichotomy or stadium in Achilles and the tortoise. 1 treats space and time as finitely divisible, the moving rose. We're going to be coming on to the fact that at the same time that Zeno is writing, Leucippus is also coming up with the first atomic theory. We don't know whether Leucippus is influencing Zeno or the other way around. Ancient philosophers now think it's Zeno influencing Leucippus, but maybe we're biased. And then the dichotomy and the arrow, and then 1 argues that motion is impossible whether space and time are either infinitely or finitely divisible, the arrow, which for me is the sort of pièce de résistance of these 4 paradoxes. And though it's 3rd in Aristotle's list, we're going to be looking at it last, because I think, I may be wrong, but I think it's the one that's going to most intrigue current mathematicians and physicists. The dichotomy and the arrow argue against the possibility of motion in itself, and Achilles and the tortoise and the moving rose argue against relative motion. Okay, now, what did people think about Zeno's paradoxes at the time? Well, we've got some clues. So in a dialogue of Plato, so Plato, born probably about 428 BCE, dies 80 years later. So in his dialogue called the Parmenides, because he was always intrigued by Parmenides, he writes about a visit to Athens, which apparently happened in about 450 BCE, by Parmenides and his younger associate Zeno. Parmenides is then about 65, Zeno about 40. And they create a huge stir. They're treated as sort of rock stars, happy days for philosophers. It's not like that now. Zeno in particular is treated as a rock star. He was apparently very good looking. He's ultra cool, as we're going to see. And it's the first time the Athenians have heard Zeno's book of paradoxes. And he gives public readings of his 40 paradoxes, which he says are apparently in support of the theory that there is just one thing being in existence. And at one of these public readings, the very young Socrates was present, about 20 at the time. And Socrates is intrigued, but puzzled. And he asks Zeno, what's going on? Do you really think we can't move? You know, after all, you got here from Elia. And Zeno replies, according to Plato's dialogue, "No, Socrates, you're wrong to say I'm deliberately setting out to deceive people. What I'm really doing is trying to support my master Parmenides. In truth, my book is a defense of Parmenides' arguments against those who try to ridicule him. on the grounds that if there only exists one thing, umbrella term, then the argument leads to many absurd and contradictory conclusions. My book attacks those who say that several things exist, aiming to show that their hypothesis, that several things exist, leads to even more ridiculous conclusions, if you examine it properly, than the hypothesis that only one thing exists. It was written with that sort of ambition when I was young, and after I had written it, someone stole it before I had even decided whether to publish it or not, he says, bashfully. I think Zeno is very good at self-publicity. So note that he admits that it's ridiculous to say that only one thing exists. And it's ridiculous to say that time and space and motion don't exist. It just happens that it's even more ridiculous to say that more than one thing exists and that time and space and motion do exist. Absurdity every way you look. I told you, he's a rock star. Right. Another clue from a later dialogue, well, no, about the same time, another dialogue of Plato called the Phaedrus. And in this, Socrates says, do we not know that the Eleatic Palamedes, that's Zeno, has such an art of speaking that the same things appear to his hearers to be like and unlike, one and many, stationary and in motion. Palamedes, as I'm sure you know, was a mythical figure famed for his rhetorical skills and credited with having written a book on rhetoric. So Zeno is here presented as a rhetorician, very skilled with words. And Aristotle seems to have gone even further. In a lost work of his called The Sophist, which is cited by a later Greek writer called Diogenes Laertius, Aristotle apparently said that Zeno was the first to discover dialectic. And I shall be suggesting that Zeno does indeed set up dialectical debates between apparent opposites and between reason and sense experience. He's deliberately trying to intrigue us and draw us in. So now let's look at these four paradoxes against motion, which is discussed in Physics Book 6 by Aristotle. Very, very elliptically. I mean, these are his lecture notes. So that's why there are so many different reconstructions of Zeno's arguments. There's lots of room to maneuver. And certainly ancient philosophers don't agree. I'm going to give you my reconstructions, and you would find quite a few ancient philosophers who do agree with what I'm going to say. You will find some who don't. Okay, and I'm going to go fairly fast through the dichotomy and Achilles and the tortoise, spend a bit more time on the moving rows and a bit more time on the arrow, which I think is the most fiendish of the lot. So Aristotle says that the runner can never cross the stadium because to do so he would have to touch an infinite series of points ordered in the sequence half, quarter, eighth, 16th, and so on. It's unclear whether the runner can't start or can't finish. I much prefer that he can't finish, as it compels us to imagine the runner already running. Extra paradoxical force. So Zeno is asking us to view the runner's goal as having to complete an infinite series of discrete, separate, sequential tasks, which of course can't be done. Now, clearly the question is whether the action of crossing the stadium has been accurately articulated. And we may well agree with Aristotle that it hasn't. The stadium is infinitely divisible, says Aristotle, but of course it's not actually so divided. As Aristotle says, infinity can refer to extremities or to divisibility. The runner does not have to complete an infinite series of discrete sequential tasks, but just take a finite number of strides to traverse a finite distance, even though in so doing he is, of course, passing over an infinite number of points. Okay, I still think the paradox is raising an interesting question. I'd be interested to know if you agree. I mean, I don't know the answer. I'm a philosopher, but I would be interested to know what you think. is the impossibility of completing an infinite series of discrete sequential tasks, is it supposed to be logical or, quote, only physical? Anyway, over to you on that one. Achilles and the tortoise. Again, we have a similar scenario here. We're looking at relative motion, and the paradox states that the fastest runner in the world, Achilles, cannot overtake the tortoise if the tortoise has a head start, because by the time Achilles has reached the tortoise's starting point, the tortoise will have moved on a little bit. By the time Achilles has reached the second point, the tortoise will have moved on a fraction again, and so on ad infinitum. So once again, we're given a scenario in which Achilles has to complete an infinite series of discrete sequential tasks in order to overtake the tortoise, and that can't be done. But of course, once again, the distance Achilles has to traverse is infinitely divisible, but not infinitely divided. And once again, he only has to take a finite number of strides to overtake the tortoise. I think it might be worth remembering the Pythagoreans here. They were a religious philosophical sect who also did a lot of work in mathematics. And at this stage in the 5th century, they're living in communities, communes really, the hippies of the ancient world, around the coast of southern Italy in the Greek colonies there. And they do a lot of really important work on musical theory. As far as we know, they're the first people to discover or realize that music can be mathematically notated. But they also do appear to have confused tiny units of space, again using that umbrella term space, with dimensionless points, and indeed with numbers. So it may be that Zeno, who's only living just up the coast from them in Elia, he may be partly targeting them and exposing that fallacy. If he is, then he's doing a big service. Right, the moving rows. I spent a fruitless day nearly trying to do a diagram, but in fact, it turns out that is way beyond my skill set. But it is very easy to describe and for you to imagine. We have 3 rows of 4 equally sized bodies, the A's, the B's, and the C's, or if you're doing it in Aristotle, the alphas, the betas, and the gammas. The A's are stationary, and the B's and the C's are moving past the A's at equal speeds, but in opposite directions. According to Aristotle, and he's really elliptical here, he just says Zeno claims he can use this setup to show that half the time is equal to its double. And Aristotle is scornful and says dismissively that Zeno's made a really elementary mistake and foolishly assumed that a body will take the same amount of time to move past a stationary body as it takes to move past another moving body. But supposing all these bodies are all meant to represent indivisible minima, chunks, quanta of space. And remember that this is the century in which the atomic theory is being developed, certainly by Leucippus, but possibly by Zeno first. If Zeno's doing that, he's going to discredit it. If Zeno does imagine an atomic theory of space and time, he's going to go on to discredit it. And supposing one moving B passes one stationary A in one indivisible minimum of time. And supposing that in this indivisible minimum of time, the moving B has passed 2 moving C's. Okay, but now imagine one moving B passing one moving C. How many stationary A's has it passed? We want to say half an A, but there is no half an A. A is already an indivisible minimum of space. There can only be a complete 1A. So in the time it takes a moving B to pass one stationary A, it has passed both 2 C's, and 1 C half the time is equal to its double. So that is it's a possible reconstruction. It's the most popular reconstruction in the ancient philosophy books. it seems to me there might be another, as well as looking at time and space as finitely divisible here. Zeno might also be saying, well, actually also, to ascertain motion is a matter of relative position in space as well as relative position in time. We can come back to that when we look at the arrow. Just a thought. Anyway, well, never mind that. Let's go back to this theory that space and time are finitely divided into these indivisible minima. Maybe Zeno's heroes think, well, okay, viewing space and time as finitely divisible is really problematic. Let's opt for infinite divisibility of time and space after all. Then, of course, you're back to having to deal with the dichotomy and Achilles and the tortoise. But supposing Zeno's heroes say, well, that's okay, we've done that, we've solved those. Okay, says Zeno, let me give you the arrow. Right. Now, Aristotle says that all Zeno's paradoxes against motion present difficulties to those who try to solve them. And I think this is particularly true of the arrow, and I'll be interested to know if you agree. You're the experts here, not me. Because on my reading, it presents problems whether you view time and space as either finitely or infinitely divisible. So what do we know? We know that Zeno says the moving arrow is motionless, the moving arrow is at rest. And notice how paradoxical that is. The flying arrow has to be flying for the paradox to work. It's not the motionless arrow is motionless, it's the moving arrow, the flying arrow is motionless. Again, Aristotle says this is really easy to solve. You can just dissolve this paradox so long as you stop regarding time as composed of nows. Ekton nun in the Greek, nun being the word for now. So let's see. Let's try to construct this paradox. And again, Aristotle is so elliptical, we're going to have to do a bit of reconstruction, or possible reconstruction, and then ask whether time is composed of nows. And to do that, of course, we're going to have to ask what this word now, nun, means in the Greek. So, premise one. Anything, and right, so this is a reconstruction. It's the one I agree with. It's the one you'll find in Kirk Raven and Schofield's book on the pre-Socratic philosophers, and it's the one makes most sense to me, but there are others. Premise one, anything occupying a place just its own size is at rest. Place comes under that umbrella term of space. Premise two, in the present, in the now, the nun, what is moving occupies a place just its own size. So 3, in the present, what is moving is at rest. But 4, what is moving always moves in the present, so what is moving is always throughout its movement at rest. So the claim is that everything is at rest for any temporal interval during which it occupies a place equal to itself. But one might counter, this is only true if the thing in question, say an arrow, occupies the same place for that stretch of time, and the moving arrow clearly doesn't. But what if time were not infinitely divisible, as in the dichotomy and Achilles and the tortoise, but finitely divisible into indivisible minima, and now referred to an indivisible minimum of time? Maybe Zeno's hearers might think, well, wouldn't the arrow then be trapped, as it were, in one indivisible chunk of time, and therefore in the same place in this indivisible chunk of time, and therefore motionless? And if the whole flight of the arrow is composed of these nows, it's sort of trapped motionless in every now of its flight. And if you're meant to regard the entire flight of the arrow as composed of these indivisible chunks, the arrow is going to be motionless throughout its flight, just as Zeno claims. So problems certainly arise if we think of time, as composed of nows and the sense of tiny periods of the dimension, tiny indivisible minima of time. So let's suppose, after all, that time is, in fact, infinitely indivisible, and now refers to a dimensionless moment, a dimensionless point. At first glance, this seems to give us a way out. You can say, okay, admittedly, you can't tell whether the arrow is moving at any one dimensionless point, as you would need reference to at least 2 points to work out whether movement has taken place. Notice the past tense. But to say that you can't tell whether an arrow is moving through reference to a single point does not mean that it's not moving at that point. And in any case, you certainly can't say that the arrow is not moving throughout its flight because the flight is not composed of dimensionless moments, any more than a line in space is composed of dimensionless points, which is probably Aristotle's point when he says we can dissolve this paradox if we stop viewing the flight as composed of nows. So this then initially looks more promising. It looks as if we've got the moving arrow moving. But we still have a huge problem on our hands, and it concerns the notion of the present. And this is where I'm hoping all you lot can enlighten me later. Because when exactly does the moving arrow move if the present, the now, is simply a dimensionless moment, a dimensionless point? What is the present? If it is simply a dimensionless dividing line between past and future, maybe we can only ever say that the arrow has moved and not that it is moving now. So problems arise with the arrow, it seems to me, whether we think of time and space as finitely or infinitely divisible. And if time and space exist, they must be either finitely or infinitely divisible, so maybe time and space don't exist after all, just as Zeno's teacher Parmenides claimed. Now, I want to conclude by raising 6 points, asking some general questions and points which arise if we consider the 4 paradoxes as a whole. So firstly, is Zeno aware that his paradoxes can be at least partially solved through this infinitely divided, infinitely divisible distinction, for instance? If he is aware of that, does this suggest that his real target is not motion, but how we articulate it, how we describe it, and hence how we articulate time and space on which motion depends? So maybe he's not denying time and space, but just saying we humans have not yet learned how to conceive of them or describe them. Secondly, as we've seen, he may be partly targeting the religious philosophical Pythagoreans, who, despite all their genuine advances in musical theory, do seem, as far as we can tell, to have confused spatially extended units with both numbers and geometrical points. And if that's the case, Zeno is saying just how important it is to distinguish a dimensionless point from a spatially extended unit, including an indivisible quantum. 3, he's certainly alerting us to the sheer oddness of 0 and infinity. Well, as he saw them, you can tell me whether they're still regarded as odd. Remember that Aristotle says that infinity can be understood in 2 ways, in respect of extremities and in respect of division, and we saw how important it was to be alive to that distinction when discussing the dichotomy and Achilles and the tortoise. He also, crucially, I think, compels us to think about the sheer oddness of now, the present. If it is just this dimensionless dividing line between past and future, then when does anything actually happen? And this takes us back to Diogenes Laertius' claim that Aristotle says that Zeno discovered dialectic. I think Zeno is setting up a dialectical debate between the relative strengths and weaknesses of reason and sense experience as possible routes to knowledge. What is the relation between them? Do we need one or the other or both? And if both, then how do we mesh them together? What's the method? And note that Zeno's paradoxes rely on reductio ad absurdum, or at least what appears absurd to those of us living in the phenomenal world, because reductio ad absurdum only works in situations where our sense impressions have real power, real traction. The very sense impression Zeno says he's trying to discredit. It's the moving arrow that's motionless, not the motionless arrow. In order to be puzzled by Zeno's paradoxes, we have really to believe that the arrow is moving and that Achilles can overtake the tortoise. And finally, underlying all this, of course, is the question of Zeno's intellectual relationship to Parmenides. He says that his paradoxes are designed to support Parmenides, to support the theory that only one unmoving, unchanging thing exists, and that means that time and space and motion are illusions. Whether his paradoxes really do support Parmenides, of course, depends on our answers to two questions in particular. How do we interpret Parmenides' way of truth? Is Parmenides perhaps himself a dialectician? And if you're interested, if you go to my website, angiehobbs.com, you'll see fairly early on the homepage links to some videos on the pre-Socratic philosophers I filmed at Sheffield University, and you'll see, I think about 6 short videos on Parmenides, because he doesn't end with the way of truth. He then writes the way of seeming. Why? Anyway, and finally, how do we interpret Zeno's tone? He says that he knows that saying that only one thing exists leads to ridiculous conclusions. They just happen to be less ridiculous than the consequences that follow from saying that more than one thing exists. So we know Zeno has a sense of humor. Is he joking in what he says? And if so, against whom or what is the joke directed? A few years back, with my public understanding of philosophy hat on, in an election, a UK election campaign, I organised on what was then Twitter, an alternative election for a cabinet of philosopher rulers throughout history. And obviously, Zeno was nominated as Minister for Transport. Of course he was. Of course he was. I mean, there were some serious ones and some jokey ones, so yes. Wittgenstein was chief whip, etc., etc. Anyway, so we know he has a sense of humor, but here we are, 2,500 years later, we're still discussing him. So I think he may have had the last laugh. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Angie. I'd written down here, as you were going through the early part of your talk, was Zeno the first public engager of science? So we're on the same page here. And for me, I've written down this discovery of dialectic and the sheer oddness of now. That's what I've taken away from your talk. But this is over to you for some questions. And I see Professor Al-Khalili's already got his hand up.
You'll have to answer your own, Jim. Yeah, so.
Thank you.
I can answer questions on ancient Greek philosophy. I may answer them in ancient Greek.
Thanks, Angie. Oh, that's very loud. A comment and a question. So a comment, I think a modern physicist will say will forgive Zeno, Parmenides, and Aristotle because they didn't know about calculus of infinitesimals. Newton and Leibniz told us that you can take small intervals and take epsilon to 0, and we're all sort of very happy. I like the point about Zeno may have been poking fun at the Pythagoreans, and actually he was smarter than we may give him credit for. But it isn't what he was doing. I mean, it's just the problem of time, the difference between manifest time and physical time. Yeah. And the opposite view, one thing, my question is, you didn't mention Heraclitus. Right. Who the father of the river of time. For him, time there is change, there is flow. That's probably what we regard as psychological time, what we perceive. And probably, would you say that Zeno and Parmenides actually are closer to what we would regard today, the time, there's no flow of time. That's an illusion. Time exists in a block universe of Einstein, for example.
Yes. So, well, even with Heraclitus, so his, everything flows, you can't step into the same river twice, you all know that. But that is still in the phenomenal world. That's how it appears to us. And that's still contrasted with what Heraclitus calls the logos, which regulates all these appearances of change. So, and in fact, Heraclitus also has a theory that time is cyclical, which then feeds on into through bits of Plato into the Stoics. So, I mean, they were fascinated by time, and a lot of them did think time was cyclical, and I think Heraclitus is one. The flow of time, they're not denying that's how, that's our felt experience of time, but what's extraordinary to me is without any kind of laboratories or anything like that, they are thinking, God, why would I trust my sense experiences on this? That to me is the real change here. It's an extraordinary thing to do, to kind of say, well, to what extent am I creating this experience? Does that help at all? Thank you.
So I have a lady here in the third row, and then I have a gentleman here further along the third row. Here.
Thank you so much for pointing out about the Pythagoras connection. It seems to me that Pythagoras was a dualist who influenced Aristotle, who is also a dualist. And so when Aristotle says that Zeno is the first dialectician, I'm just wondering how we actually resolve the dichotomy between the dualism and the dialectics, because this seems to have been a 2,000-year tug of war between the two camps. On the one side, you've got Pythagoras, who created the table of opposites that Aristotle then subsequently put into his law of excluded middle and square of opposition. And then, 2,000 years later, it appears in Turing's tuples. And then on the other side, we've got the dialecticians, so Heraclitus, Hegel, Heidegger, and there seems to be this irresolvable tension between the dualists and the dialecticians about, these issues of space-time and motion.
Yes, thank you. And of course, Aristotle, unlike Plato, unlike the others, does put a lot of trust in sense experiences. He says, first take the phenomena. We have to start from where we are and see whether we can argue to first principles from there. We can't start from first principles. Indeed, I don't, so the classic answer is you've got the debate between the mathematicians and the biologists, but that doesn't quite work for the Pythagoreans, who are mathematicians, but also seem very, very strongly have this dualist vision. Do you not think there can be, that some of the dualism might be set up as a dialectic within the dualist positions?
The dualism is contrastive, whereas the dialectics is comparative. That's how I'm sort of defining it mathematically.
Yeah. So I can't answer this. One thing that might be relevant, when I rang my daughter last night and sort of said, well, what do modern physicists, do modern physicists believe in time and space? And she said it depends on their philosophical position, but they might not know that. And so maybe right at the bottom of all this, and I'm in a room of scientists, but maybe there is a fundamental emotional kind of pull to one vision of, a mathematical vision or a biological vision or whatever. I don't know. But it is intriguing. It is intriguing. But I am wondering whether some of the, you can get dialectical exchanges within a dualistic universe. But thank you. Thank you.
So we've got a patient gentleman here with a question, and I'll see if we've got time for yours. I'm not sure.
How would Parmenides and Zeno deal with the argument that well, Zeno and his paradoxes bite just as hard on illusion as they do with reality. And obviously, if the phenomenal experience is actually not, doesn't refer to anything in the really real world, we still definitely have it. And we still definitely have the illusions. And Zeno would argue, oh, well, obviously you couldn't have the illusions because they're paradoxical.
Okay, so it might be helpful to look at, there are 4 other paradoxes we didn't look at, and in the 4 against motion, it looks, and in that quote we did from Plato's Parmenides, it looks as if he clearly thinks that being is just slightly less absurd than the world of phenomena. But in the 4 other paradoxes we didn't look at, like the millet seed and something can't be in the place in which it is or the place in which it is not, etc., it looks as if he is querying both the phenomena but also the logic. And in that case, we've got a real dialectic. He's saying, you want to find out about the world and what really exists and what's true? Well, you've got your reason and you've got your sense experience. Those are really your only 2 routes, either separately or in some kind of combination, but I'm going to raise problems with both of them and see what you think about that. So I don't think, you said he would deny that we have this illusion. I don't think he's ever denying we have the illusion. I mean, you know, he thinks he has illusorily come from Elia to Athens.
Is he arguing that we could not have the illusion?
So sorry?
Is he arguing that we could not have the illusion?
So we can't hear you.
Oh, I see. I've understood. Now, Plato and Aristotle will say that or certainly Plato, who thinks it's an illusion, but also says we can't, as human beings in this embodied life, we can't live without it. Zeno, does he think we could do without the illusion altogether? I'm not sure, because he does raise his problems with the logic too. If you look at the videos I've done on Parmenides, you'll see that I actually say that Parmenides is a dialectician, also raising problems with, because the way of truth is self-refuting in Parmenides. We don't have time to go into that today, but so here you've got 2 guys raising problems with both reason and sense experience and then saying, well, over to you, what are you going to do about it? But we still live in this world, and they're not, I don't see either saying that as embodied human beings, we can completely discard the illusions.
Okay, Angie, we've got time for one more question. The gentleman in the plaid shirt was very...
So I'm also an imposter. I'm an engineer. When I was at school, they taught me that you can make an infinite sum of things like the distance between Achilles and the tortoise, and there's an infinite number of terms, and they get smaller and smaller and smaller as you go. So to be honest, the last few don't matter, so don't worry your head about it. It's all fine. So from my engineer's perspective, yeah, that's Zeno solved, move on, let's build a building. Would a philosopher say, well, yes, actually, the people, well, French people in the 18th century or something solved this? Or would you say, hang on, you swept it under the carpet, but it's really still there?
It's interesting. So I have heard so many debates between philosophers and mathematicians on exactly this point, about whether that's okay or whether you're brushing it under the carpet. And the mathematicians all say it's fine, and the philosophers say, no, it absolutely isn't. I mean, I think 2 things. One, it's the notion that what Achilles and the runner are being asked to do is, Aristotle initially, he changes his description. He initially just says touch on an infinite number of points, but then he rephrases it later on. And he says they have got to do these tasks individually, one after another, and complete each task before you can go on to the next. So that's one thing. The other thing is, in one of the other paradoxes we have in Simplicius, which is just paraphrased, Zeno himself appears to raise that issue, that either infinity just goes on and on forever and ever and things get bigger and bigger, or it just disappears into nothingness. He actually seems to anticipate a little bit of that, but he kind of leaves it hanging. So he doesn't get to what Jim was talking about. But I think he's not. He does see the problem. He's edging towards that. He can imagine that a solution like that might be envisaged. Thank you.
Thank you. Can I ask you all to thank in the time-honoured way?